שיוויתי השם ונגדי תמיד, 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 ונגדי תמיד. שיוויתי השם ונגדי תמיד.
Welcome to Spirit of the Torah. This is our episode on Vayeshev, and he settled, referring to Jacob, Yaakov, our patriarch, who settled finally in the land of his fathers, in the land of Canaan. And Yaakov is hoping, after so many years of conflict, running away from his brother, and then all the trickery of Lavan, then running away from Lavan and having to face him, and then wrestling with the angel, and then facing his angry twin brother Esav eventually, who had wanted to kill him previously, and eventually seeming to have at least some kind of reconciliation with him. And then the drama of his daughter Dinah being kidnapped and violated, and the ensuing conflict. So many conflicts, so many dramas. Jacob is hoping that finally, now he's arrived back home, he's going to have years where he can just live quietly and enjoy life. That's all he wants. And unfortunately for him, that's not what happens. His favorite son, the son of his old age, Joseph, becomes an object of jealousy and hatred of his other 11 sons, and they throw him in a pit, and he's sold as a slave. The story is well known. There's a wonderful musical about it. And of course, as always, I'll put all the links to all the sources I'm discussing in the show notes, so you can look up everything I'm talking about in the Torah itself and then all the commentaries. And there are many questions that arise from the whole saga of Joseph and his brothers. We're beginning now already. This is the first of a 3-part series, a trilogy about Joseph and his brothers. It's this week's Parsha Vayeshev and the next week's Miketz, and then finally in Vayigash there is the reconciliation. Even then it's incomplete and it carries on in different forms throughout our history, but those are the 3 parshiot which really tell this particular chapter of the story. 2 of the questions we're going to think about, of the many questions that arise from this story. One is, if the Torah is presented in our tradition as infinite and eternal, the blueprint for all creation and all existence, and a condensed version of the infinite one. The Talmud says that the word Anochi, the first word of the 10 commandments, I am, is actually an acronym for God saying to us, I have given over my soul, whatever that means, soul of the infinite one. I have given over my soul to you in the Torah. So if the Torah is all those things, then why, we may ask, does it contain stories about people who are so obviously fallible and human and do bad things to each other? What is the divinity that we learn from brothers treating each other in this awful way in this whole saga, Joseph and his brothers? And the second question, which is very closely related, is according to the Kabbalah, according to our mystics, Joseph is the ultimate paradigm of what it means to be a tzaddik, a righteous person. We've actually talked about this a fair bit already on this podcast, different episodes. For example, the Rosh Hashanah one. He's a righteous person. That doesn't mean he's perfect. A righteous person, says Proverbs, falls 7 times but gets up again each time. But to be a righteous person does not mean you're perfect. And Joseph clearly isn't perfect. Very obvious from the text of the Torah itself and our tradition that he's definitely not perfect. And yet, he becomes the archetype for a tzaddik, for a righteous person. And if that is the case, then why is it that he puts his brothers through the whole long, elaborate saga? And if you're familiar with the story already, great. And if not, then you're going to have to read Vayeshev and also Miketz and also at least the beginning of Vayigash to understand what I'm talking about, because he tests his brothers at length. It's a whole long, involved story of how he tests them with repeated comings and goings from the land of Israel all the way down to Egypt and back up again. And he makes his brothers do enormous amount of work to put them through a process to help them, it seems, make teshuvah, to help them return to their better selves, return to their divine root, and fix what they need to fix internally, so eventually there can be a reconciliation. But why does he do it the way he does it? Why isn't there honest communication up front? And especially given when Joseph is down in Egypt, when he is missing, when he is a slave, his family has absolutely no idea if he's even alive. At the very least, and this is a question asked by many of our commentators, why doesn't Joseph send word home to his elderly father, who is grieving him, who is mourning him, who thinks that he is probably dead? Why doesn't Joseph send word home to Jacob, to Yaakov, and say, hey, just so you know, I'm alive. I'm okay. You don't need to worry about me. To help us address these questions and many others, we're going to look at wonderful teachings. First of all, from the Chernobyl Rebbe, the Me'or Einayim, the light of the eyes. Very important, early Hasidic master, student and friend of the Baal Shem Tov himself, and also a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. And sometimes on the Parshiyot, on the Torah portions of Bereshit, of our book of Genesis, he has many, many, many teachings. But on our Parsha, on Vayeshev, he just has one, and it's actually quite short by his standards, and it's about stories. And this is some of what he says in this quite short but very powerful teaching. He says, the Torah that we have today, the scroll that we put in the Holy Ark, that is not the infinite eternal Torah, which is the blueprint of reality. And this is something that all of our mystics agree on. The great mystic Nachmanides Ramban says that all of the Torah is actually God's names, and it's just broken up into words to reflect our planet, our reality that is given in. So the Torah could potentially take many different forms depending on the world that it actually is given in. But the Me'or Einayim says we know the Torah is actually infinite and eternal and beyond any stories, beyond any specific details happening to any specific people and so on. But our ancestors, their lives, their stories, which are written in the Torah, that was the Torah that needed to be revealed in our world at that time that it happened. And he's very bold and very radical because he says, actually, the Torah has to be re-revealed in every generation through stories. But it's not only the stories which are written in the Torah, which contain that guide for us to how to live our lives, because that's what he says Torah is. It's a moreh derech, it's a tour guide. It's a guide for the path of our lives. He says the stories of every generation are revealing the Torah. The stories of our own lives are revealing the Torah, are revealing what we need to learn to live in the best possible way. And he says, some folks are more uplifted by stories than by Torah. Some people, Torah in its conventional forms, it just doesn't reach them. It just doesn't work for them. It just doesn't help them do the work that they need to do to live the best possible lives. Those people need stories. As a result of that, he says, whenever we speak, whatever we say, whoever we're speaking to, every single day of our lives, whatever context we're in, every single thing we are saying at all times should be about leaving Mitzrayim, Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. Mitzrayim also means the place of constricted consciousness, as he says. So every single thing we say should be assisting us and whoever else is hearing it to leave constriction of consciousness and enter an expansive consciousness. And he says, if that takes the form of everyday speech and stories, then so be it. That is what some people actually need. And he says, by talking about worldly things, with this intention of expanding consciousness and awareness, what we're actually doing is bringing the infinite divine into more and more and more of existence and revealing the oneness of everything so that it's more and more available for everyone. The stories are a very powerful way of doing this. And now we're going to turn to Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who's very influenced by the Me'or Einayim. Rabbi Nachman himself was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. It's clear from many of his teachings that he imbibed the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov sometimes specifically through the Me'or Einayim, through the Chernobyl Rebbe. And Rabbi Nachman has a lot to say about stories. In fact, Rabbi Nachman, first of all, you should know, if you don't already know, he wrote many wonderful stories, very powerful stories, written with very primal archetypal characters and events. And these stories, which are often studied as literature and compared to Kafka and Borges, Rabbi Nachman said, the world thinks that stories are for putting people to sleep, but I say that stories are for waking people up. And that is what his stories are for. And many of his stories have served that function for many people. And Rabbi Nachman says, talking about Joseph in the role of the tzaddik, the righteous person, whose job it is to channel goodness and oneness into the world and help wake people up to the oneness of everything, to the reality of oneness. Rabbi Nachman says, the tzaddik, Joseph, of course he wants to wake people up to the truth of oneness, but it can't be done directly. The way that we are in this world, the way that people are so lost and distracted in darkness and confusion and dualism and so on, people need to be woken up through dreams and interpretations of dreams and stories and tricks and accusations and tests and so on, and all the dramas that the story of Joseph and his brothers illustrates. So this comes down to us through Reb Nosson of Breslov, the great student of Rabbi Nachman in Likutei Halachot. And he says, this is why Joseph does everything he does. This is why it takes 2 and a bit parshiyot for this story to unfold. It's long and involved, and people don't want to be woken up directly. So stories are a powerful way to lead people to awakening And moreover, Rabbi Nachman says, stories create us. Stories give birth to us, just as they gave birth to those who came before us, our spiritual ancestors, and those who will come after us. In other words, we are links in a chain. What really connects our chain? Is it physical biology? Is it blood? Is it DNA? Well, we know you can become a Jew, and we know that you can choose to be Jewish, and we know that you can also choose to opt out of the Jewish story. And really, the story is what ties us together. If we opt into the story, if we choose to see ourselves in the story and make it our own, Rabbi Nachman is saying that is actually what gives birth to us as who we are, just like it did for those before and after. So we are links in a chain where the defining characteristic of the chain is actually the story. And Rabbi Nachman says something very interesting about stories, referring to his own stories, but it could be applied to others too. He says it's actually best not to reveal what the mysteries in the stories are, because then they're most powerful. Meaning, when we look at Rabbi Nachman's stories, there are many different commentaries which explain the meaning of all the different characters and events in them. And that's great and that's wonderful, but he's saying it's even more powerful when the meaning is just unconscious, when it's just tugging away at us under the surface without us even being fully aware, consciously, cognitively, intellectually of what it means, but it's still having an effect on us. I know it's so true for me with so many stories in the Torah and other stories sometimes that they have an evocative or an emotional effect on me. And then when I hear an analysis of them, it can be satisfying and it can actually partly address some of the issues involved, but it doesn't fully account for their pull on me, for the way they tug at my heart and my consciousness. It's bigger than just one perspective, one analysis. And just like the Mur Einaim that he seems to be very influenced by in this matter, as in others, Rabbi Nachman says there are people who cannot be healed through Torah. In general, Torah is the great healer, but some people are in a place where Torah is not going to work for them, and those people need stories. And he says there are stories of ancient primal archetypes, which relates to Keter in the tree of life, the crown, Ratzon, desire, which relates to our most primal desire, the very core of who we are, our deepest yearning. He says these stories of ancient primal archetypes tap in to our deepest longings and desires, and they can help us heal from the darkest places, from places that even Torah cannot help us. As an aside, Carl Jung, who is known in modern psychology for his work with archetypes, not a Jewish person, but he discovered Kabbalah and Chassidut late in his life, and he wrote in his journal that his entire life's work had been foreshadowed by the work of the Maggid of Mezrich, the great second-generation Hasidic master, the leader of the movement after the Baal Shem Tov. He said, everything I've done in my whole life in psychology, this man already knew and already did. And then Carl Jung himself entered deeply into Kabbalah in terms of his own psyche, to the point where he was having dreams in which the characters and storylines were the Sefirot of the Tree of Life of Kabbalah and the way that they interacted. Back to Rabbi Nachman, and just a couple more things about why he said and how he said we use stories to awaken. First of all, he says, it doesn't work if the person doesn't want to be aroused and doesn't begin to at least arouse himself. And this is a principle going back to the Baal Shem Tov and others. You cannot help somebody who does not want to help themselves. Somebody has to want to be free, to want to be awake, to want to be a better person, to want to make teshuvah, to want to return, in order for us to help them. If they do, he says, then we can use these powerful stories to help them, and it's better than using Torah, which is not going to work in this case, because it's going to expose them gradually to the light of truth in a way that will not overwhelm them. Just like he says, someone who's locked in a dark room and their eyes are not used to the light, they need to get used to it gradually. Another reason, he says, to do this process of exposing the person to the truth gradually through stories is that it will not attract or increase opposition or resistance from outside. And finally, so that it will not attract or increase opposition from inside, that it will overcome the opposition and resistance that we all have to change inside of ourselves. That last point is very deep, because he actually says not only do we want to do it gradually so as not to increase or attract internal opposition to change, which again we would all have, he says it's even deeper than that. We actually need to play a game of dressing up, of deceiving in a certain way, the part of ourselves that fears change. In other words, we need to play a little trick on that part of us that maybe is fearful, maybe is hurt, maybe is wounded, maybe it's the inner critic who just says everything is bad, whatever it is. We need to play a little trick on that part of ourselves. And he says stories can help us do that, because they dress up the truth, they package the truth in such a way that it can help us get past those inner voices of resistance, opposition, fear, and so on. And now hopefully we understand a little better, from the perspective of Rebbe Nachman, the Chernobyl Rebbe at least, why the Torah is full of stories of people who are clearly so imperfect, treating each other so imperfectly, that we are supposed to be awakened by these stories. And for me, the reason that is the case is because they're so human and so truly resonant with our experience. If the people in these stories really were some kind of weird saints who were actually perfect, as is sometimes depicted, I personally wouldn't relate to them at all. It wouldn't be helpful for me. It wouldn't help me grow. So because these stories are about people who had the same struggles and emotions as us and go through the same sufferings of this world, because of that, they can have this amazing awakening effect on me. And to go back to the teaching we started with from the Mo'anaim, remember he said also that our own generation's stories and our own stories are also a continuing unfolding of that infinite truth of the divine Torah, that it has to be renewed in every generation. So may we find that divine truth in our own stories and in the stories of our own generation. May we continue to find the fuel and the nourishment that we need to awaken ourselves and awaken each other as we go through our lives. So in terms of a practice for this week, there are many different ways I could present it. First of all, let's just be more sensitive to stories. Let's notice when stories are at work in the text of the Torah, in the stories of our own lives, in our relationships, and what's going on around us. And let's begin to discern which stories serve us to awaken and awaken others. Which stories make us more aligned with truth and love and the values that we want to live in our lives. And if we can do that, then maybe we can aspire to the practice instruction given by the Chernobyl Rebbe I mentioned at the beginning, which is that everything we say should be a Yitziat Mitzrayim, a leaving of the place of constriction. That everything we say should be an act of liberation. No matter what context we're in, no matter who we're speaking to, no matter what we're speaking about, may everything we say be serving that cause of awakening and liberation. May it be so, and may we support one another in making it so. Have a great week. Shabbat Shalom.